drought, climate change, air quality, these are all things that impact us. And tonight's guest presenter is going to give us a little bit of insight into what they're thinking about these things over at North Carolina State University and at UNC Chapel Hill. Tonight's guest is Jordan Kern. He's an assistant professor at North Carolina State University in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. I think this is maybe the third time I've done an event like this in coordination with the museum, and it's always so great, and in no small part because of the excellent staff at the museum. And actually share my screen and get the show on the road. But a nice example of how great the staff at the museum are is that Katie Amman at the museum dreamed up a very catchy title for this talk, Drought Can Take Your Breath Away. So thanks to Katie, and thanks again to the museum for having me. This research is a collaboration across 3 different universities, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, NC State, and the University of Utah. So I do want to take a minute to introduce the other folks on this research project: Jared Bowden at NC State, Greg Schracklis at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm Jordan, I'm at NC State, Tamlin Pavelski at UNC Chapel Hill, Mackenzie Skiles at the University of Utah, and Jason West and Andy Yates both at UNC. So I guess the provenance of this research project and this talk is a new research award that was issued to our group by the National Science Foundation as part of their long-running research program on the dynamics of coupled natural human systems, which is a bit of a buzzword. And so I thought I'd unpack that just a little bit. So what do we mean by, or what does NSF mean by a coupled natural human system? So that really refers to any sort of biological or environmental system that impacts and is impacted by a human system, whether that's a specific community, a broader socioeconomic system, or infrastructure. And so NSF's really interested in the complexities of the relationships between natural and human systems and the feedbacks between them, and how all those relationships could evolve in the future under different sources of change. And so in our case, the natural system we're really interested in as part of this project is drought. And what causes it? We know a lot about that already. Interactions between larger scale atmospheric processes, local weather, how that manifests as precipitation, either rain or snow, and then also how weather impacts and interacts with land surface processes. So how does rain and snow get deposited on the land and then distributed across the land or taken up by different processes? And how does it end up as water in streams and rivers and lakes? And so I guess a bigger picture question that we're interested in that's more forward looking, I think the pertinence of this will become a little more clear in a few minutes, is whether droughts are also correlated or related to other types of weather phenomena, especially higher air temperatures. And so I think that'll become more clear why that's important in a minute. But looking forward, I think it raises sort of an obvious question of whether drought will become more frequent and severe in the future as the Earth undergoes climate change. So that's the natural system that we're interested in. And the human system that we're interested in is actually our own exposure to air pollution. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of different ways that people can be exposed to air pollution. We're actually focused on a pretty narrow subset of those sort of exposure pathways, in particular energy production, specifically electricity production at power plants, and transportation, so cars and trucks. We're also interested in understanding more about how people can be exposed, and their exposure is not only a factor of where pollution is emitted, but also how it travels to where people live and how the spatial distribution of where people live with respect to where it's emitted can influence how bad people are impacted. And so I guess a bigger picture question that we're interested in this area is whether or not we're able to predict specific periods of really bad air, because really bad air quality that might significantly impact people's health acutely varies through time, and it varies across space. And so we also want to be able to understand that what the costs are, the economic cost associated with health impacts from air pollution. So that's the natural system, drought, human system, human exposure to air pollution. So the first connection between these two that would fall under the definition of a coupled natural human system, this link is actually causal in nature, right? So what we're specifically trying to figure out is how drought might exacerbate human exposure to air pollution. And again, unfortunately, there's actually more than one way that this can happen, that drought can impact human exposure to air pollution. And if you've been reading the news or watching the news in the last couple of months, you may already have one in mind, which is wildfire. So we're not going to talk about wildfire tonight, and it's not actually a part of this project. There's a different sort of discrete mechanism that links drought and air quality, and that is electric power systems. So the reason that electric power systems can form this link connecting drought and air quality is because of the unique way that drought, especially drought that's combined with a heat wave, can impact the grid. So this is a really simple diagram of a connected high voltage electric power system, right? So we have a network of different power plants that are producing electricity, sending that electricity over transmission lines to where people live and where they consume that electricity. So power systems like this can be uniquely impacted by drought and heat waves in a couple ways. The first thing that happens during a drought is that we may lose the ability to produce electricity at hydropower plants. That's because during a drought, there's less water flowing in rivers and streams. So that means there's less water being stored in reservoirs behind dams, and that's the fuel that we would normally use to produce hydropower. That's really unfortunate because hydropower is a way of producing electricity without emitting any greenhouse gas emissions or other harmful air pollutants into the atmosphere. The other thing that can happen, especially if a drought combines with a heat wave, is that air temperatures go up and demand for electricity goes up because we're all using our air conditioning more. So the combined sort of forces of less water and higher air temperatures can actually put more pressure on other types of power plants to increase how much electricity they're producing in order to meet our collective demand for electricity. And in some cases, emissions from these power plants, depending on where those power plants are located in relation to where people are living and the prevailing meteorological conditions that might transport those emissions to where people live, and in some cases trap those emissions where people live, we can see the buildup of harmful levels of air pollution, in particular particulate matter, fine particulate matter, and ground level ozone. Another thing that I'll point out is that this can be especially harmful if air temperatures are really high, because it sort of fundamentally accelerates the air chemistry that forms these pollutants that harm people. So this is not just an idea. We can observe a big piece of this puzzle. So we don't know yet how exactly to attribute human health impacts from bad air quality to drought through this specific link of the electric power sector, but there's a lot of evidence that this already occurs. So what this figure is showing is some data from the state of California. There's a blue line and a black line. The blue line is tracking something called the Palmer Hydrologic Drought Index. It's essentially sort of a general measure of how much water is available. And so you can see that in California, it goes up and down in sort of a cyclic manner. So when it's really high, that means that the state of California has a lot of water. And when it's really low, it means they don't have so much. And I'll call your attention specifically to the period of 2012 to 2016, which was one of the worst droughts in the state's history. So the other line that I'm showing here, this black line, measures the fraction of electricity that's being consumed in California that is produced by power plants that use fossil fuels. So the interesting thing here is that these lines are out of phase, meaning when the blue line is really high, the black line is really low. That suggests that the amount of water that's available in California directly influences how much electricity they're producing using fossil fuel plants. So that gets us from this sort of causal linkage between the natural system, which is drought, to human exposure to air quality via the impacts on electric power systems. The other last piece of this that would constitute a truly coupled natural human system in NSF size needs to be some sort of feedback that goes back from the human system to the natural system. And in our research, what we're really interested in understanding is how changes in human behavior may alter emissions of air pollutants and how that may actually change the water cycle. So let's start with how humans may respond to exposure to air pollution. So I hope for all of us, we don't just sort of sit there and take it. And there's a lot of ways that we can reduce our exposure to air pollution from the electric power industry. Not all of those involve replacing different types of power plants with renewable energy, although I'll get to that. So this first example actually involves more sort of dynamic, strategic management of different types of power plants in real time to reduce the exposure of humans to harmful air pollution on really bad air days. So let's say that this coal plant that's in the foreground, we know is overwhelmingly responsible for human health impacts in this city that's also in the foreground because it's contributing to the formation of particulate matter and ozone. So one possibility that's been discussed and studied a lot is that we could actually increase our use of this natural gas plant in the background that might be further away from where people live and whose emissions might be less harmful. And that would allow us, in some cases, to temporarily reduce our dependence on this coal-fired power plant and reduce human exposure to these harmful air pollutants in the city. It's a really cool idea, and there's a lot of promise there. There are also unanswered questions related to this type of strategy. The first is, what if doing this is a lot more expensive, right? It might increase people's electricity costs. That might be a cost we're willing to pay, especially if it allows us to reduce, the health burden on certain communities that would be exposed to air pollution. But we don't know how much it would cost. We don't know who would pay those costs, how those costs would be allocated, distributed across society. And we don't know how the benefits of cleaner air in this particular case would also be distributed. So that's one thing that we're interested in. The other question is whether, especially during air pollution episodes that are related to drought and heat waves, whether this is even an option. Because having a drought and a heat wave at the same time creates scarcity on the grid, which means that our supply of electricity from hydropower goes down at the same time that our electricity demand goes way up. And in cases like that, the grid can sometimes struggle just to meet our electricity demand. A really nice, well, unfortunate example of that is what happened in California a couple months ago. So they had record air temperatures, electricity demand went through the roof, and they essentially ran out of electricity and had to institute rolling blackouts for the first time in 20 years. So an open question here is whether we can use this type of strategy to help reduce air pollution if that air pollution is occurring during episodes where the grid is almost running out of energy. So moving forward, and I'll sort of pick on California again, we can't just think about the way we manage air pollution in the grid that we have today, because the grid that we have today is rapidly changing, and it's changing faster in California than basically anywhere else in the country, right? So one of the things that is happening in California is that the state is aggressively pushing towards a decarbonization of their grid, so eliminating sources of greenhouse gases in their electrical grid. And so in addition to that, What we're really interested in understanding is how that transition, coupled with potentially widespread vehicle electrification, may alter fundamentally the emissions of pollutants into the atmosphere. For sure, there are a lot of co-benefits, and this would be a great thing for air quality. What we don't really know is how it might actually alter the water cycle, because emissions from different types of power plants and transportation form aerosols that go up into the atmosphere and actually sort of collect moisture and form the seeds of precipitation. Another way that this could alter the water cycle is by altering snowmelt patterns. So sometimes the emissions from especially diesel vehicles go up into the atmosphere. And in a place like California that gets most of its water from snowmelt that starts out as snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, those emissions get deposited on the snow and it creates sort of dirty, contaminated snow. So dirty, contaminated snow is darker, which means it absorbs more of the sun's radiance. Lighter, whiter snow reflects more of the sun's radiance. So what we're interested in understanding is how a transition away from dirty, contaminated snow to fresher, sort of whiter, more reflective snow might alter the amount of snow that melts each year and the timing of that, which could directly influence the timing and amount of water in streams and rivers and reservoirs that essentially create the fuel for hydropower production, which kind of brings us full circle. So I don't have any results to show because we just started this project. We've only been active for about 2 months. We anticipate this being a multi-year, at least 3 to 4 year long project. That's why we wanted to stop by the museum to talk. I wish it were in person, but it's on Zoom. We really like engaging with the public to get ideas and feedback before we start on these really big, ambitious science projects. But I did, before I close, I wanted to mention something about methods. So it's interesting, we have 7 different people, researchers working on this project. And I don't think anyone's going to be working in a lab, and I don't think anybody's going to be working in the field. This is almost entirely going to be a computational computer modeling project where the outputs of one model are going to form the inputs of another, and we're going to link them all together to try to describe the way this very complicated system works and how it could change out into the future. So the first thing that we want to do is link together models that describe the way larger scale climate change and meteorological processes influence local weather. So precipitation, wind speeds, temperatures, and how that weather then interacts with land surfaces processes to deposit water into watersheds. And then we want to understand how that water gets either stored or runs off in watersheds into streams and rivers and lakes and reservoirs behind hydroelectric dams. Then we want to link it to models of electric power systems. So this is what I do. So we build software that describes the way the grid works. So networks of power plants all connected to places where people live and consume the electricity. And that gives us a chance to simulate and sort of replicate the response from the electric power sector during droughts and heat waves and understand how that response may change out in the future as a result of climate change, but also as a result of changes in our reliance on renewable energy. So we can track very specifically emissions from these power plants up into the atmosphere. And then also then we combine that with models of multi-phase chemistry and aerosol physics that help us understand the formation of air pollution and the distribution of that air pollution across space and across time to impact people's health. Then we want to ask all sorts of questions about who's impacted, when, how much is it going to cost, and what can we do to fix this problem. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much to the museum again for hosting us, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Jordan, thank you very much. Really,
Sure.
really interesting stuff to think about. And I don't know, it's always interesting to me to think about the impact that humanity has on the environment. And especially like talking to experts, it always goes further and deeper than I think it will. Like, especially you start talking about these feedback loops between, what a drought and a heat wave leads to more air conditioning, leads to electricity usage. And there's probably even more parameters that go into the
Sure.
modeling.
And we're leaving lots of stuff out, right? I mentioned wildfire. I mean, there are lots of sources of pollution that might be tied to drought that we're not even going to consider. Part of our focus on the electric power sector was that it's sort of this discrete system that we can kind of draw a box around, and we were really confident that we'll be able to understand it, right, at the end of the day. But yeah, the world's a very complicated place, and I think there's I think a big push among the scientific community, certainly at NSF, to embrace this complexity, right? And to bring groups of scientists together that do lots of different things so that we can tackle problems like this that are complicated, because we don't want to solve problems that look sort of too sterile and not reflective of the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. Tell you what, let's bring in and introduce the other special guests who are here. Hey everybody, check it out. If you're tuning in, you actually get more than just Jordan on the show tonight. Jordan brought friends.
I did, yeah. So we have two additional researchers here tonight, both full professors at UNC Chapel Hill, one of which was my PhD advisor, Greg Shiraklis. Greg is a water resource engineer. And the second person is Andrew Yates, who is an economist at UNC Chapel Hill and an expert in both environmental and energy economics.
Glad you could both be with us.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
So, Greg, I'll start with you. Can you give us like the elevator's pitch summary of what your involvement in the project looks like?
Sure. So a lot of what Jordan's talking about are modifying existing systems to respond to these hydrometeorological events, so drought or extreme temperatures. And if you're talking about modifying these systems at unexpected intervals, there really can be a lot of financial impacts associated with, let's say, for example, shutting down a coal plant or ramping up or ramping down hydropower in response to the availability of water. And so what that does is it puts the owners of these assets, often large power utilities, in a very tough position because they have these unexpected reductions in revenue at times when they just don't see them coming. And so what we try to figure out is how often these things might happen, and then give them some tools for figuring out how to level out revenues during these times. Sometimes it's simple things like holding cash in reserve so that they can compensate for reductions in revenues. Sometimes it's trying to take advantage of what we know about these natural systems, the fluctuations in temperature or fluctuations in water availability, to build some clever financial instruments wherein when drought hits a certain level, as evidenced by a reduction in the PHDI, the Palmer Hydrologic Drought Index that Jordan showed earlier, there's a payout, so compensating for those reductions. And the idea being that if we can make it less financially risky for these organizations to try these new techniques, that they're much more apt to do them, and that there should be some environmental benefits that come along as a result.
All right. And Andrew, you were introduced as an economist playing with a team of scientists.
Right. So in Jordan's PowerPoint had those little dots for pollution coming from the power plants, right? And so my part of the job is to turn those little dots into dollars, right? So how much does it cost society when pollution goes up, right? So people breathe that in, they have a greater risk of getting disease or greater risk of dying. And then what's the cost to society of that? And also, how is that distributed? Is it distributed equally or is it distributed unequally? Are there some populations that are subject to sort of much greater harms when pollution increases, or much greater benefit when pollution decreases? So that's the part that I'm responsible for.
Oh, wow. Okay. Changing the dots to dollar signs. I like that was an easy description for me to, I like that. That was good.
It's
Immediately I got it. It was
ano-
like, all right,
another catchy title for a future talk.
Dots to dollars.
dots.
Yeah.
It sounds like a song title, maybe a good movie. Y'all got lots of ways you could go with this. All right. Well, there's some questions in the chat that I'll throw your way if you're ready.
Sure.
Kate wants to know, sounds like your focus is on California with most of your researchers in North Carolina. Why not focus on North Carolina?
We are. So we actually wrote the proposal with a focus on both places equally, right? So, and there's a reason for that, right? These are two places that experience drought, experience heat waves, and the connection between drought and heat waves potentially very different ways. They have electric power grids that are very, very different and have very different trajectories as well. And also the distribution of where people live and the weather is different in both places. And so we felt like it was a risk to just focus on one place. And so what we wanted to do was be able to study two very divergent cases and understand sort of the key or salient differences between those, with the hopes that the findings that we come up with will be more broadly transferable across the United States, but also globally. So it's a great question. California is so easy to pick on because of stuff that's happening there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes for really good comparison, right? Because you could say 2 months ago was a great example of this happening versus maybe 10 years ago in North Carolina.
Yeah.
We were in a drought.
Yeah.
And saw the impacts from it.
Yeah, and California in general relies much more on hydropower. I mean, if you look at the distribution of where we have hydropower in the United States, it's almost all out west. And that's just because the topography is different. Those are snow-driven systems where most of their water first falls to the earth as snow as opposed to rain. And there was a lot of dam construction built for other reasons, right? For flood control or to, supply water for irrigation. And hydropower is sort of the icing on the cake. So there are all these historical reasons why they have way more hydropower than the East Coast. But what that means is that there's a sharper response, right? In terms of their increased use of fossil fuels during a drought. At the same time, that's also the part of the country that is decarbonizing their grid the fastest, right? So when there is a drought, they usually replace it with something that's a little less harmful. On the East Coast, we've been a bit slower to move away from coal, which is really the culprit when you talk about air quality. And so when there's a drought in North Carolina, even though we lose less hydropower, we're replacing it probably with something that's more harmful. So it's an interesting dynamic.
All right, thanks. All right, the next one here, Glenn is asking, is climate change going to reduce the amount of snowpack in the winter and result in less water for hydroelectric power?
Oh, we have a hydrologist on the team. So there's two really key parts of how climate change would influence hydropower. The first is maybe less precipitation falling, right? So then you get less overall hydropower. What the question was referring to is potentially less snow in the winter. And so that is true. So as temperatures increase, one of the things that is likely to happen is that less precipitation will fall as snow and more will fall as rain in the winter. And there's issues with that because when you have a lot of rain happen in the wintertime, sometimes the people that operate the reservoirs have no choice but to let it wash downstream, as opposed to if it fell as snow, then that water gets stored up in the mountains until later in the summer. The other thing that could happen, is very likely to happen, is that the snow that does fall is going to melt earlier in the year. And so that's really unfortunate for a place like California, where a lot of their electricity demand is highest in the summer. In the future, what is very likely to happen is that a lot of the timing of the hydropower will shift away from the summer to the winter and the spring, when actually they don't need it as much. So it's kind of a problem.
The next one here is, will you be working with power utilities directly?
I asked and they politely declined. Sometimes it's hard to get them to write official letters of support. And I don't blame them, I guess. But I will say, especially Greg and I have had a very long, productive relationship with Duke Energy and with major utilities in California, including Pacific Gas and Electric. Sometimes those are informal, but they respect the research that we do. And sometimes we're asking questions that they don't have the bandwidth to ask. So we definitely plan to work with utilities in some way, but not in a formal sort of official capacity.
One thing I might add to that is we have a lot of good data on the electric power industry. We know a lot of things about how much fuel they use to generate a unit of electricity, and we know how much emissions come out of their smokestacks. So it's not critical for us to have a partner in the industry.
I 100% agree. Yeah, a lot of what we've done in the last several years is develop models that it's not exactly what happens on the grid, but it's 95% there. And so we've drastically reduced our need to have industry partners in order to accurately represent what's happening in that sector.
Kate wants to know, would this impact people's jobs? Parentheses, things like closing plants.
Yes, of course. I think the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy will absolutely impact people's jobs. It could create a lot of jobs, but those might not be in the same places where, if that's the question, right? Are we going to be taking jobs away from places of the country that are responsible for the mining or refining of fossil fuels? As we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, yes, unequivocally, right? And I think that's a real danger, and it needs to be upfront as a consideration when we transition quickly away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy. But it might be worth it. That's right. That's
yeah.
really
that seems to be the.
Yeah, we have a really, really big fish to fry, right? And I don't these days feel as optimistic about our ability collectively to tackle big challenges like that. But that's what it's going to require, I think.
Yeah, it seems like any decision, anything that we might think about doing comes with trade-offs.
Sure.
Right? If we leave the coal-fired plants going, then they continue to pollute and degrade air quality, and at the same time contribute dramatically to climate change, which is going to hurt people's livelihoods in the very near future as well.
Yeah, to an incalculable, degree. I think the example that we talked about in the talk of dynamically switching between coal and natural gas plants, or even in cases where those coal power plants are replaced by other sources of generation, that in particular is not something that I would anticipate causing job losses at electrical utilities, right? If we reduce our reliance on coal, what happens is there are no coal mining jobs, right? And so that would impact Appalachia and the Mountain West, the places where we get coal. But the power plants themselves, coal power plants, are located all over the country, and those would be replaced by other power plants that the same utility owns.
How fast is the turnaround? So if we, you know, if we adopt these implemented strategies, if we implement these strategies to slow down these feedback loops or stop them, how soon do we see the positive effects of that?
So the feedback loop, I guess,
Well, like so,
there are a
some
couple.
of
Yeah, go ahead.
well, so I'm thinking, you know, some of the impacts of climate change are baked in because there
Yeah.
is so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now. So we stop putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. At what point are we seeing fewer droughts, fewer heat waves that lead to some of the drivers of putting more pollution into the air? Does pollution in the air come out really quick so we get some benefit there as we make the transition to these uh, you know, green energy futures?
I don't know, and I would be really skeptical of anyone who said they did know. I will say that climate change is a lot more uncertainty and a lot longer lag, right? Both in terms of what the response would be and, well, right, I'll leave it there. But when we talk about air pollution that would directly hurt humans' health, right? So exposure to fine particulate matter or ground level ozone, those are impacts that we can have in terms of reducing, emissions of pollutants from power plants that lead to harmful concentrations of those. Those are very quick effects that we can have and benefits that we could see if we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels more generally, or if we pursue some of these more creative strategies to, in real time, relieve some of the pressure from the system. So, if we notice certain days that are really, really bad air days, dynamically switching away from the worst polluting plants, right? That's something that we could just directly have a benefit for human health.
Let me just add that we had a rather dramatic example of what could be like, or the world would be like if we cleaned up a lot of sources of air pollution in April and May of this year. If you noticed how clear the skies were during those times when we were all out walking around in our neighborhoods because there was nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really interesting time, right? I mean, even major news media picked up on, uh, cleaner water and cleaner air and skies that people hadn't seen for years, just because economic activity, people moving around a lot and using a lot of resources just stopped.
Yeah, I think it's the blessing and a curse, right? I
Yeah.
don't want is cleaner skies to come at the expense of economic, downturn, right? And I think that's an argument that's used against like pursuing renewable energy or at least pursuing renewable energy quickly. And you brought up trade-offs. I think it's in our future, right? Navigating really tricky trade-offs here, at least with respect to climate change.
Right. So what do you think, what are the timelines here when you're talking about the pairing of droughts with heat waves that lead to these other issues that you're studying? Are we looking at, is this every other year we should be expecting drought plus heat wave? Is it 10 years?
Well,
Or is it cyclical in a way, I guess?
These are generally rare events, right? At least if it kind of depends. It's hard. This is a hard question to answer because if you go back and look at the data that we have, right, recorded, water availability data in California and North Carolina, it suggests that these are rare events, right? But we're basing that sort of, sense of probability or return period or the frequency of the cycle on observable data that probably occurred in a climate that is different than the one we have today, and it could be different than the one we have in the future. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there will be more or less water in the future, depending on where you live in the United States. There are other aspects of climate change that are, I would say, easier to predict. And one would be increased air temperatures, right? So to the extent that heat waves are causing drought, right? Especially that's a tighter link on the West Coast, like in a place like California, then yeah, I think we would expect droughts to become more frequent and severe as air temperatures increase. But I don't know. Yeah, I wish our colleague Tamlin was here. He would be the perfect person to answer this question. Maybe Greg can take it.
You know, Chris, there's one other thing to consider here is that we expect incredibly high levels of reliability from our water and power. We expect the lights to always come on. We expect there always to be water that comes out of the tap when we turn the knob. And so it's these extreme events that really drive the design of all of these systems. We don't design them to meet demands under average conditions. We design them to meet demands under the worst conditions. And so if we don't think very clearly about that, it can be really, really expensive. And the sorts of system that Jordan was describing earlier is one that's adaptive, that where we can move things around, which is a little bit different than just building so much capacity that we can meet demand under any conceivable circumstance from a very set number of assets. Right. So there's an opportunity to save a tremendous amount of money by building systems that are a little bit smarter and a little bit more flexible, both on the power and the water side.
I like the idea of a smart system. Adaptability, flexibility. I mean, that's what we talk about when we talk about people's daily life and how life could change under climate change scenarios. And that's what we hear. We're going to have to adapt and learn how to be flexible. And find innovative solutions instead of just trying to build our way out of everything. Kate wrote that maybe your comparisons with California will encourage the East to consider greener options.
You know, at the end of the day, it's politics. I think people drive the pressure and the influence that would encourage state governments to enact policy that requires utilities to meet, renewable energy targets. We have those in North Carolina. They're more modest, obviously. North Carolina's been a great place for solar in terms of being very friendly towards utility scale solar for many years. But yeah, it comes down to politics, whether people are pressuring state government to write rules on utilities that require them to meet a certain amount of their electricity by renewable energy. Now, this is in absence of any sort of federal law. And there's just 1,000,001 federal laws and incentives that can shape strongly, right, the options that utilities have about, choosing a natural gas plant over a coal plant, right? And that's, increasingly happening. Or keeping a nuclear plant open, right? Or pursuing solar or something like that. But it's pretty patchwork at the moment. The states that you see moving most aggressively towards renewable energy, there's just seems to be more political will to make that happen. And to pay for it, because it's not super cheap.
Katie, hi Katie, thanks for watching. If the future is about trade-offs, how do you think we should manage that discussion in the public arena?
I'm so pessimistic about this. We're about to get a lesson in how, we can't talk about complicated things in an hour, right? So I just think I don't know where the detailed, complicated, nuanced discussions happen, but it's not on television. So I don't know. That's a great question. Andy, Greg.
Just like, well,
you stumped the panel, Katie.
Yeah. I worry about that almost more than anything else, right? Rather than like the impacts of climate change, I worry about like just not being able to like solve complicated, long-term problems as a society, right? I think that's don't feel good about that one.
But it says something, right? That here are three smart people who are putting in time and the effort to try to understand these things. And then, we all hope that in the 3 to 4 years of this project, at the end of it, you have information, you have data, and conclusions that you share, and you say, all right, here's, we put a lot of people in the room, socially distanced right now, and tried to hash out what we think these problems, these issues could bring, right? What's going to be the problems? What are the trade-offs? What are the benefits? And what are the innovative solutions to get us through it? And I mean, that seems like so much of the work that has to be done, right? I've been coming back to lately that a lot of the problems that we face and that we seem to struggle with just require smart people doing the work, coming up with the answers and the solutions, and that a lot of the noise that happens around that will fall off because there are people doing the work and there are people not doing the work. And
Chris,
when smart people are doing the work, we get good solutions.
If you wanted a little more optimism, you could come and spend some time with any of our research groups where we've got some really bright, motivated young people, graduate students, and if you ever wanted to feel a little bit better about how things are going to go, that's a place where you get that feeling. And I do think that there's lots of innovative solutions being worked on. As Jordan pointed out earlier, we've spent a lot of time with power utilities, water utilities in the past, and understanding exactly what their problems are and their constraints, how they are limited in terms of the new solutions, really brings a lot to our work, right? Then we understand how they might be able to implement some new solutions and which things might not work for them. At the end of the day, though, I'll quote a friend of Andy's in mind who would always talk about the incentives. It's all about the incentives. And so it's partly about having smart people coming up with some new innovative ideas, but you've also on the other side got to have people that are incentivized to make a change. And so it's a combination of both of those things, I think.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Speaking of points, I think the last question that I'll throw out. Okay, second to last question. Might the rewards in the scientific community evolve to provide more incentive for scientists to engage the public? Here we've got three of you doing the science cafe.
I think I got the gist of it, but I didn't quite hear the beginning of the question. And so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, sure. I'll share it again. Might the rewards in the scientific community evolve to provide more incentive for scientists to engage the public?
Oh, yeah. I would guess Greg and Andy, I'm a bit of a rookie, so they may be better poised to or positioned to answer this, but my perception is that that's happening, right? That there's increasing emphasis on public-facing science in the proposal process, where if you just look like you're going to be cloistered for 3 years on a campus and not doing any engagement work, they ding you big time, right? And I think there's a real interest, especially at NSF, right? Other funding agencies might be a bit different, but NSF is really, really into engaging with real stakeholders, but also making sure the science is relatable to younger audiences, especially K through 12.
So Chris, about maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago now, the National Science Foundation implemented this rule in which on the first page of your proposal, you have to describe two things. You have to describe the intellectual merit, so what's new and different, what new knowledge will be generated. And then the other category, what they call merit criteria 2, was broader impacts. So how will this research have broader impacts on society? And so you have to describe those very clearly. And typically, you have to begin to engage with various stakeholders in order to accomplish those goals, those broader impacts. And so there is an increasing push, certainly relative to 25 or 30 years ago. And I view it as a good thing. So I think that there are other agencies that have very specific missions, like the Department of Energy, that will be looking to serve the interests of the power utilities and so forth. But in terms of the public generally, NSF has certainly made a big effort to try and push researchers in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Now we're on to the last question. And this one, it actually goes to Andy. Does the black dot on your wall have any significance?
It's a pollution dot.
Turning that dot into dollars.
It's a Nest thermostat.
Turning that dot into dollars.
Turning the dot into dollars. That's right. Yeah.
You turn it down and your dollars go up.
Right. Well, or to tie it into the research we're talking about, one potential policy they could put in place with these Nest thermostats is that if for some reason you want to change the amount of electricity being consumed during a drought period, you could remotely adjust everyone's thermostat half a degree and they won't even notice it, and yet save tremendous amounts of power. So
very interesting.
We probably won't include that in our model, but that's something that could be done.
Oh, wow. Are there groups experimenting with this or thinking about it, utilities, or? I've never heard of such a proposal. It sounds cool.
I would be surprised if Nest is not working with an electric utility, but I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Duke
interesting stuff.
has voluntary programs where they can cycle your air conditioning unit. They pay you to do this, but you know it's a good bet that it's going to be on the hottest day of the year. So I don't know how many takers they have. Yeah, we have that on our house. The problem is that's kind of blunt. It's like they turn your air conditioner off. Right. Whereas the thing I described, you might not even notice it. Right. Yeah. But when you take it in the aggregate, you can get a fairly large amount of power savings.
All right. Well, Jordan, Andy, Greg, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for sharing out. And I'll look forward to chatting with you in the near future to learn more about how the project's going.
Likewise, we'll definitely be back.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Go ahead.
I think he was just saying goodbye.
Oh, okay. It was all right. Live show, everybody. Okay, well, everybody, thanks for joining us for the Virtual Science Cafe tonight. Hope that you enjoyed the program. You can share this YouTube link with anybody and everybody to get the word out about the research that's going on with this team of NC State, UNC, and University of Utah researchers. Keep in touch with the Museum of Natural Sciences too. You can do that by following us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We're at Natural Sciences. And hey, the Science Cafe comes live to you every Thursday night at 7 o'clock right here on the museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. So I hope that you'll join me again next week, 7 o'clock Thursday night. We've got a really great topic for you. We're going to be talking with Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods. They've just written a new book, Survival of the Friendliest. So we're going to be talking about their book. You can purchase copies of their book from the museum store's website. Just hit up naturalsciences.org. Brian Hare has done some amazing research on canine cognition and primate cognition and people. And Vanessa Woods, same thing, has been doing the puppy kindergarten at Duke University alongside the Canine Cognition Center at Duke. So I think we're going to have a really good chat. I've worked with Brian before. Great stuff every time. So all that said, you don't want to miss the show. How do you not miss the show? You subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel. You click the bell next to that to get notified when we're bringing you new content here on YouTube. And you can do the same thing over at our Facebook page. So I hope we'll see you all again real soon. Until then, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.